Hi everybody, this is Jacob Bear, Science Tutor Online, and today I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret about textbooks, and this is that you don't really need to read them most of the time. A lot of textbooks were created with the convenience of teachers in mind, and they're not as useful for the students. And what textbooks are is they're really just like maps and outlines of the course, and they kind of show you what you need to know. And if you understand how this map and this course works, then you don't need to read most of the book itself, and this means you have hours and hours of time to get back to playing Minecraft or sleeping or doing whatever else you want to do. So here, let me show you a textbook for an example.
This is from a biology textbook I used a few years ago, and you can notice, let's say you're assigned to do section 9.5. It says there's a subheading here for this title, and this is what you're going to be looking at, because this clues you in on everything you need to know and study in this section. So it says fermentation and anaerobic respiration, so obviously you're going to be reading about two things here, fermentation and anaerobic respiration. So I would write these down on my notes on the side. You don't have to do that now, and I won't do it now, but that's an idea. And it says that these two things enable cells to produce ATP without the use of oxygen. So I would think, okay, so how do cells produce ATP without the use of oxygen? That's really the question that this section is going to answer. And as you read this section, you'll have that question in mind, and you should find an answer to it. And you'll also be trying to think of what fermentation and anaerobic respiration are and the steps that take place in those two things. The first section we come to says types of fermentation. And so when you read it, you're going to ask, okay, so what are the different types of fermentation? And you'll come up and write those down or see those as you read. And as you read along, you'll notice there are actually two things in bold. Over here at the top, you see alcohol fermentation, so that's one type of fermentation. And over here, you see lactic acid fermentation. So you've got an answer to your question, what are the two types of fermentation? And over here is a nice diagram explaining how alcohol fermentation works and also how lactic acid fermentation works. So without even reading the text, already you've got a sense of what it's trying to tell you. You know some of the answers. Now here we've got a section comparing fermentation with anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So now you're thinking, okay, there are three different ways that ATP can be made that we know of. One is fermentation, one is anaerobic respiration, and one is aerobic respiration. And presumably if you've been reading the chapter, you have an idea of what some of these things are already. And then the rest of this chapter just explains how these different processes work. Here we've got a bit more information about obligate anaerobes and facultative anaerobes. You probably have to know what these two things are since they're in bold. We do know, since you see the word anaerobe here, it has something to do with anaerobic respiration. So now let me show you, we've got just the headings and the diagrams. Let me show you how you'll put this information to use in your studying.
Now that we looked at that, let's break it down, and I'll show you how you can write an outline and later how to draw it out. And this will save you hours of time, as I promised. So we've got this title of the section, Fermentation and Anaerobic Respiration enable cells to produce ATP without the use of oxygen. And then underneath I put the questions that would come to mind from doing this. So always when you read and study, you want to have a question in mind that you're going to answer. So the questions here would be something like, what is fermentation? And what is anaerobic respiration? And if you know what those two things are, you've already got part of this section down. And then the real question is, how do cells produce ATP without the use of oxygen? And as you can see, they do it through fermentation and anaerobic respiration. So right there, if you know what these two definitions are, you really don't have to read this section at all. In these section subheadings, as you saw, one of the subheadings is types of fermentation, and the other one is comparing fermentation with anaerobic and aerobic respiration. And underneath there's subheadings, there are these bold words. So without even reading the section that's headed types of fermentation, if you see alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation in the bold type, then you know what the two types of fermentation are, and you may be able to get by with not reading the rest of it. You'll probably have to know the process of fermentation, but at this point that will be really easy for you to figure out by looking at the diagrams in the book, because you already know there are two different kinds of fermentation. Now underneath here we've got two more definitions in the bold type underneath the second subheading, comparing fermentation with anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So you've got these obligate anaerobes and facultative anaerobes, and all you have to do is figure out what these things are, and then you'll get a sense of how anaerobic and aerobic respiration compare. And you can ask yourself the question, how do anaerobic and aerobic fermentation compare? And you've got your answer already. If you're still a little confused, let me just show you how I would draw this. And this is similar to a technique called mind mapping, which I'll teach you in another brain tip that's really useful. But for now, let's say you start out with a circle with your main question, and you recall from looking at the title of this section, you came up with the question, how do cells produce ATP without the use of oxygen? Attached to our question, we've got two answers. They produce ATP without the use of oxygen through a process of fermentation and the process of anaerobic respiration. So now you've got an outline that really answers the top question. And now you just have to know a little bit about fermentation and anaerobic respiration, and you've got this section pretty much down. So fermentation, there's alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. And under anaerobic respiration, they didn't really give you examples, but there's a question here. We've got obligate anaerobes and facultative anaerobes. And there's a question mark here because we don't really know how this ties in with the rest of the chapter. So you may need to read just that one little section to answer this question. But if you know what obligate and facultative anaerobes are, then that might also give you enough information to move on. And if you do just this, you've got enough of the knowledge from this section that if you had a quiz on it, you'd probably get at least a B on it. So you'd certainly pass. And if you wanted to dig a little deeper, it wouldn't take much effort at all to get an A. So try reading it now. We just spent maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I'm not sure how long this video is, going through a section, and we did it in a kind of a long way. If you did this on your own, you're going to get faster and faster at it, and pretty soon it'll just take you a few minutes to zip through a chapter of a textbook. So at this point, you probably don't have to read the entire textbook. And with a little bit of practice, as I said, you'll get quicker and quicker at this until you get to the point where you really don't need to read it all. You just pick it up, read the headings, take 5 minutes, and you've pretty much learned what you need to learn from that chapter of the textbook. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not telling you not to read or to spend less time reading. I strongly recommend you read as much as you can, as often as you can, in as many different fields. But there's so many good books out there and articles and blog posts and all kinds of really useful bits of information that you should be reading. And they're generally more fun and more entertaining, and you'll learn more from them. Textbooks generally aren't very good, in my opinion. Ditch your textbook, don't read your textbook, just map it out, get your information from other ways, use your own brain, and thanks for listening. Keep on learning.